I remember watching television in the living room, sitting on the carpet while my father was in the recliner on the couch. And when Alan Alda or someone delivered a line on MASH, I'd glance over to see if my dad was laughing. Or when something racy came on, maybe a joke that pushed the envelope, I'd watch his face to see if it was too much, if we should be embarrassed. Without ever talking about it, I absorbed certain tastes, certain values. And in an analog world, identity is formed by the people you are proximate to. Your parents, your siblings, your teachers, your coaches, friends, real people who play definable roles in your life. Maybe to some degree, your identity is formed by culture, by books, TV shows, movies, music you listen to. And from the vantage point of maturity, you can look back and trace those lines. This is what made me who I became to some substantial degree. But something fundamentally different started happening with smartphones and the internet. Instead of identifiable people or pieces of discrete culture shaping our outlook, we began to absorb an infinite scroll. Facebook posts, tweets, Reddit threads, podcasts, videos. Oh, so many videos. Never ending, really. And all of it composed a worldview. What's funny? What's not? What's aspirational? What's pathetic? The algorithm probing, testing, running an infinite series of experiments on each of us, every swipe, every click, every pause. So that even if we spend day after day, night after night in the same home, in the same room, each of our individual views of the world is increasingly completely different. If the internet is anything, it is an identity formation machine. And increasingly, it is forming us into tribes with identities more extreme and more separate from one another than ever before.
So true, John. I love your reference to sitting with your parents and watching things. I have such clear memories of checking in to see how they were reacting to things, especially, God, if people kissed on television, it was like, oh God, I'm in the same. Now kids don't have to worry about that because everybody's got their own screen in front of their face. Today, we're going to talk about the algorithmic involvement in radicalization because it's more dangerous than I think it's ever been before, and it's helping to cultivate this extremist misogyny, a force that's just metastasizing across all online spaces, and it's moving from online to offline as real world violence and terror. And someone who knows a tremendous amount about this is our guest today, Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She's a professor in the School of Public Affairs and Education at American University and the founding director of PERIL, the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. She's also the author of a new book, Man Up, which takes a very hard look at how misogyny is driving extremism, violence, and terror throughout the Western world. Though, Cynthia, you go to great pains to make sure that people understand in your book that you don't think this is just a Western phenomenon and it is happening everywhere.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be in conversation about this.
It's such an important conversation. Before we get into really talking about the online spaces and how those are contributing to extremism and radicalization, I want to take a step back into the real world for a moment. Can you help us understand how the culture that we're all swimming in is helping to lay the groundwork for people and men and boys in particular to become radicalized?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a couple of different ways to understand what's happening with misogyny and sexism becoming so much more normalized in real life, in real culture. I mean, just this week we had President Trump tell a journalist, quiet piggy, to as a very like casual aside to shush her, and it's a silencing or stifling, and that also is intended to insult and diminish all at once, right? I mean, two little words that he didn't even have to think about that just slipped out, quiet piggy. And, that comes on the heels of Secretary of Defense Hegseth saying we need male standards, of Mark Zuckerberg saying we need masculine energy in the corporate world, right? These kinds of things that would be hard to imagine public leaders in the corporate or the government worlds saying in all seriousness, even 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and not being sort of sanctioned for that either by their colleagues or by the culture more broadly, right? It's a kind of and so there's this normalization and this legitimation of this resurgence and this return to both a framing of male superiority on things like standards in the military or energy in the corporate world as natural, as desirable, as a return to something that we should have. I mean, the New York Times runs a piece that was critiquing this speech, but with the title a couple of weeks ago, "Have Women Ruined the Workplace?" Right, and you
Oh
can't
my
even
God.
imagine, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
and then they changed it to like, "Has liberal feminism ruined the workplace, and can conservative women save it?" or something like that, right? Like this, but it was about a speech that was given at a conservative conference that basically argued women have ruined the workplace because their natural or God-given biological tendencies go against the kinds of leadership skills that are needed. These things would be not even debated. They would be so completely fringe a few years ago, even. And so the fact that those types of conversations are happening in the mainstream say that this is not just an algorithmic issue. It's not just an issue of what teenage boys encounter online. They see receptive echoes of those same kinds of messages, online. I mean, in real life and in the news and among elected officials and leaders and people they admire. I think when you get to what they encounter online, which I'm sure we will in a minute, it's even worse, right? Even more egregious in terms of what they're being taught as success strategies as they grow into men. And too many of them admire those types of approaches that exploit women, that aim to control women, that teach manipulative tactics, that position women as lesser than and men as having to be in control, and manipulate, and then scapegoat women and feminists for the problems that they face. So, we'll get into that, but we're talking about people like Andrew Tate and others like him who have, I'm headed to Australia today, a 1/3 approval rating among teenage boys in Australia, 20% in the UK and the US. It's very high, and he's only one of 1,000 guys like him who teach dating academy tactics, sex advice, relationship advice, bedroom advice, success strategies, on how to get your life together, kind of life advice, basically, that often involves control and manipulation of women.
It's a fascinating thing, the way that that subculture has metastasized online. And I wonder how you think about the role of maybe young men, young people, but certainly young men in this case, their desire for community, for meaning.
Yeah.
What it seems to me that is like a core part of human identity. Just generally, we want to feel like we belong someplace, right?
Yeah.
We know the in lingo, whatever, but
Yeah.
what role is that playing, especially in like gaming communities and different sorts of online communities?
Yeah, there's so many different components to this. I mean, I look at Niobe Way's work on intimate friendships among boys, for example. She studied them for decades and has written about the way that boys consistently lose their intimate friendships with other boys starting at puberty. So around 11 or 12, they start to, as kids, there might be physically even hold hands or touch or like tangle their legs up on the couch while they're watching a movie or something. That changes very quickly when they hit puberty because they're afraid. It's homophobic, basically, fears. They're afraid of being called gay, but there's just so much gender policing around that, around what's acceptable for boys. And so girls get to continue that, even physical kind of, tangled up on the couch watching a movie kind of intimacy with friends, but, brushing each other's hair, braiding each other's hair, doing each other's makeup, like just physical intimacy in friendship ways and emotional intimacy. And boys really, most of them lose that to a big extent. And so I think one of the things that, fuels this loneliness crisis, if we will, like there is, boys and girls are lonely, and they're both lonely at very high rates. They're spending much too much time online, much less time to a huge percentage of much less time in person with their friends compared to even 10 years ago. So there is loneliness across the board. The difference, I think, for boys is that they are offered with quite persuasive sets of sort of influencers online answers to why they're lonely, why they're struggling, and they're struggling in other ways. They also have 3/4 of the deaths of despair. Suicides are high among Gen Z men right now. Drug overdoses, alcohol-fueled deaths. Traditionally male jobs and labor markets are declining. So it can be very hard, I think, to see a future that has agency and a sense of efficacy in it for a boy right now. And when an influencer says, hey, guess who's to blame for this? Feminists or Jews. Those are sort of the number one and number two usually. And so you can kind of, this is how you reassert control in your life. And here's some tactics to do it. And so when they're spending much less time than they ever have before with other people, including with girls and friendships, right? So you're just not engaging. Your algorithm's delivering very gendered content that puts you in totally different worlds. And so I interviewed an 18-year-old girl this summer who said, she's with some perplexed kind of, tone to her voice. She said, my parents had all these friends that were like the other sex or the other gender, like boys and girls mixed friends. And she said, I don't have a single straight male friend, and neither do any of my girlfriends. And she said that's true for everyone she knows. And that, boys and girls in her school would spend time together, but only if they're dating. And so I do think that we're also seeing, like, in person, a lack of just understanding and communication and relationships with someone of the other sex, and in ways that can also make it harder to contradict what you're reading online. If what you're reading is girls are deviant and are going to try to get you to fund their life, or they're going to trick you and lie, or all the kinds of conspiracy theories that circulate about girls, and you have to have a strong hand to control them, and this is how you get these fancy cars and successful, wealthy life, which is your measure of being a man. And there's nobody to counter that, because they don't have friendships with girls who tell them, like, that's ridiculous. And I'm not devious. I'm not lying to you. Like, I'm a normal friend. So they don't have that kind of same understanding that our generation had, I think, and that in ways that are really sad.
It's so incredibly sad that we are where we are now, that when I was growing up, I had a lot of male friends. My closest friend in high school was a guy, and but I still didn't feel like that, everybody had that equal comfort having friends of both genders, and expected that by now we would have gotten to a better place, that we have actually regressed from,
Totally.
35 years ago when I graduated. It's just staggering that this is now where we're at.
I say this all the time. Two of my closest friends from high school were guys. I lived in a house with 10 guys in college and 4 other women. I'm in a big house. The women have been my lifelong friends I'm very close with, but I can't imagine my life without those friendships with men, and how much I've learned from them, and how much we still get together with each other's spouses. And it's just, been an incredibly rich and important part of my life, and understanding kind of the full spectrum of humanity. And I just can't imagine the world that our children are growing up in, which is so much more gender segregated in the content that they consume, and also in the social relationships that they have, with some exceptions. I think there's still sort of like theater kids, actually, where there's, there's certain groups that are like thrown together where you might see more friendships. But then those also are kids that tend to then create alternative, kinds of alternatives to the norms of teenage gender policing, right? And so might attract kids that are, queer or gender expansive in their identities, but also, performative singers, musicians, artists, and so you do see it in some places, but it's much less likely among the athletes, among the fraternities and sororities in school. And so, one of the other kids I interviewed this summer, a 20-year-old, for a podcast, he said, the strangest thing, he went to a conservative college and he couldn't believe when he got there, all of his male friends were referring to women as females, just like that's how they, like, this female in the class, right? This kind of, he's like, it's just so strange, right? Like, yeah, weird. Like,
Really
he's like, it's
weird.
just like, what are they doing? And he's like, her name is Jane. Like, you can just say Jane, like that female over there. Like, it's just clinical, right? In this kind of weird way. And I don't know where that comes from, but it's the kind of thing that wouldn't have happened as much several years ago.
It's sort of hard to imagine that happening without the kind of flattening that the internet does, right? We're all kind of separated into this sort of two-dimensional thing, very, very easy to manipulate. And I wonder what I know at Peril you approach violent extremism, at least in significant part, from like a public health perspective, thinking about it as what can we, um, as you think about this sort of bifurcation of male and female relationships, the loneliness that comes along with that, all of the misunderstanding. Are there public health approaches to that? Are there policy approaches that can reverse some of that you think might work?
So the public health approach basically says, hey, just like we have come to treat heart disease or diabetes, not only once the incidence of disease shows up, but also a couple of decades upstream by educating communities about choices they can make that might lead to better outcomes, both with food, dietary choices, but also exercise, and also try to create structural conditions under which people can make those choices. So addressing issues like food deserts or healthy walking trails or those kinds of things, the cost of gym memberships getting subsidized by insurance companies, right? So those are public health approaches to prevention of disease. And so when we talk about a public health approach to the prevention of mass violence or targeted violence or terrorism, it's the same thing. It's sort of looking at what are the things you could do far upstream that make all communities healthier, have better well-being, and safeguard them against digital harms in particular that can lead them to be persuaded by harmful content like propaganda or conspiracy theories or manipulative malinformation. And so a lot of this is digital media literacy that starts, we have a program for kids that's K-5 that's just, kind of teaching kids about how do you know if something's true online? How do you know, how can you detect if someone's trying to manipulate you? How do you know someone is who they say they are, right? So safeguarding and promoting digital safety, but also understanding what AI is, where it gets its information, that kind of stuff. So that's very upstream. That's going to have a broad variety of outcomes, not just for prevention of violence. For teenagers, we do a lot of short form video called pre-bunking, which also, again, teaches about the manipulative tactics of bad actors. And then you give them a microdose of the propaganda to explain it, but you're sort of telling them, go forth, be skeptical, make up your own mind, but just be aware that that people are using these tactics to try to persuade you of something that might not be in your own interest. And what we have found consistently is that teenage boys in particular really don't like to find out they're being manipulated. That's what the data shows. And young people, nobody likes to find that out, but especially young people are much more likely to reject propaganda or conspiracy theories when they are rejecting it through being skeptical of a manipulative tactic than if you're just trying to counter argue with them, where they feel like, you're trying to change how I think, right? So we often say we're teaching people how to think, not what to think. Just like, when you do a heart healthy class, anybody can still make their own choices about what they eat or how much they exercise, but at least they're informed now about the kinds of things that might lead to healthier outcomes for their family and their own bodies. And so that's essentially what the public health approach. When it comes to gender, that means teaching, for example, that if someone's trying to sell you a product or get you to sign up for a subscription or pay for a course, just think twice, right? Who's profiting? Who's profiting off of your $8 a month or your $49.95 subscription to the Hustlers Inc. University or whatever it is, right? That is literally, selling these manipulative tactics, and also trying to think about, what are they doing to get you to believe these things, like scapegoating or fear mongering, right? Or cherry picking data, right? So there's all different kinds of digital literacy things that you can say, just keep an eye out for this. And if you see it, just think, be aware somebody might be trying to profit off of you in some way, get you to vote in a particular way, get you to buy a product, get you to make a decision that might not be something you would have otherwise been persuaded to do.
Digital literacy seems to be a multi-pronged or multi-generational, multi-role
Yeah.
issue that parents tend to have
Yeah.
real problems with digital literacy,
Yes.
and our regulators have huge
Yeah.
problems with, like, we've seen the congressional hearings where they have
Yeah.
attempted to question people who own the social platforms, and it is just unbelievably cringeworthy because they don't really even know how to use their mobile phones. So
Yes.
where do parents begin, and where do we even
Yeah.
begin with regulation? Because clearly these places are not going to self-regulate.
Yeah.
They've shown us they're going in the opposite direction.
Absolutely. I mean, we do direct interventions with kids and teenagers, and sometimes adults when the issue merits it. Like we've done vaccine propaganda, firearms propaganda, things that are also targeting older adults who might be persuaded by advertisements or manipulative information or false pseudoscience or something around medical safety. But we mostly the work we do with adults are things like toolkits and guides and trainings, and we do those for parents, teachers, mental health counselors, faith leaders, coaches, athletic coaches, people who are in and around the lives of young people. And the goal there is, you're teaching them what their kids are seeing online so that you better understand kind of codes and signals and the types of spaces and places, the kinds of apps that they might download, the types of unencrypted or unmoderated forums that they are encrypted or moderated forums that they might be spending time in, apps that they should be worried about, knowing that like by the time we ever get a training together, there's these things have changed, so the kinds of things they should be looking for, not only these specific things. But of course we pre and post test those guides and those trainings for knowledge, for willingness to intervene, and for confidence that you can intervene effectively. And so that knowledge piece is also, it's a digital media literacy intervention for the adults too, right? Because they're learning about it. And what's really interesting is we also study those longitudinally to see how long do people remember what they learned. And so, for example, with parents, we studied 1,500 parents for 12 months. Every 3 months, we followed up with them after they read our guide to see, like, had they intervened with the young person? What did they do with the information? So we find about 6% or 75 parents said that they directly intervened with a young person who they now understood was exposed to potentially radicalizing or harmful content, within the first 3 months. And the number one place they did that was in the car. And so, like in a carpool or driving their kids somewhere where you're not making eye contact, right? That's a really interesting situation, and then an effective place to do it. But we also found that their confidence that they could intervene, their willingness to intervene with a child or a teenager or a young person who's exposed to content, once they realize it, their willingness was dependent on their confidence that they could do it effectively, and their confidence was dependent on how much they know. So those three things are really intertwined. So improving someone's knowledge boosts their confidence, and that boosts their willingness. But we also found then that after 6 months, they forgot what they learned. But for 3 more months, they stayed confident and willing to do it. And so we actually went back to the funder. It never worked out, but we said, hey, what if we did a booster after 6 months, like a little video that went out to remind them of what they had learned, so that, we could maintain the effectiveness of the intervention for longer. And so we're kind of learning, like public health research does, about what's effective, what helps equip communities with tools to safeguard their families and their loved ones, and how long they're effective. And so you can sort of think about the investments. It's not cheap, right? We are now 100% philanthropically funded because all federal funding is gone for this in the US. And so, thinking about why should donors be spending money on this in the democracy funding space. So having the evidence of its effectiveness is really important.
I'm interested. We've kind of mostly implicitly talked about children and sort of relationships with young people, but at the other end of the spectrum, these issues are very much I may certainly affect every age group, but I think older people are particularly vulnerable. They're lonely. They're not native to this technology, and unfortunately, you can't kind of make them submit to a digital literacy video in class or whatever. Like it's a little harder. You have a little less control over that population, right? And so I wonder, about that group. If we think about the health of our democracy, certainly young people are the future of that democracy, but in many ways the present of that democracy is older people. They vote in higher numbers.
Yes.
They're right. They have more time to engage, so they are very material to the outcomes. And
Yeah.
it's been amazing. An older person in my life, in a random conversation, started quoting what's his name, Jordan Peterson, to me, and I was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and it's the power of these platforms is that they're kind of intimate spaces, right?
Yeah.
You watch them alone on your phone or on your computer, or whatever. They're not mediated by any kind of social space. You're not, as I was kind of saying before, in watching television, you would get cues from other people. Is this okay? Is this
Yeah.
too far? Is this,
Yeah.
is this a little, but the intimacy of the internet kind of removes all of that. It's sort of the speaker speaking directly into your brain. And I don't know
Yeah.
I wonder if you have thoughts about how we
Oh
counter that.
yeah, I have lots of thoughts. I mean, one, it's insidious. It's not just like that. There's no counter to it the way there might have been in a social context when you're watching. It's also like it sort of affects the way people think, I think, before they realize it's affected the way they think. So I have a sort of bro adjacent. I describe this guy as a bro adjacent neighbor, who already was like a little broy and then started spouting kind of TikTok theories on gender to me because he knew I was writing a book on misogyny. And I'm like, that's a TikTok. Like, I know that TikTok, that there's a TikTok video that circulates about men and women can't be friends. There's a TikTok that circulates about men have to do all the work in bars to pick up women. Like, I know that. So like like suddenly someone's TikTok becomes a theory on gender as if that's evidence, right? So, and so I think that's part of it. People start thinking that they're kind of, oh, that makes sense. And so they're persuaded by this, affable influencer or somebody whose video has gone viral and as suddenly like a theory on social relations. Whatever app you're on, you're going to see these videos. And so that's one thing. The second thing is I think grandparents are really interesting because you can reach grandparents. Often when I give public talks, like libraries or public engagements about the book or about other books, it's a lot of older people there because they also have time. They're looking for ways to engage, and they come to university talks that are public. And so I always engage them as grandparents. And one of the pieces of advice we have, I think grandparents can be really effective if they have a good relationship with their kids or some relationship with the grandchildren, more effective often than parents of teens at having conversations about technology, because grandparents can do this thing where they put the kid in the expert seat and say, can you explain how Instagram works? Or I don't really understand what these buttons mean. And can you, I really would like to understand how a meme works, and I don't really understand it. Is it the same thing as a cartoon, like when I was growing up? And, kids expect their grandparents to be clueless about technology. They also know their parents are more clueless than they are, but they might not have as good of a, engaged relationship and ability to talk between teenagers and their parents at any given moment. So grandparents can be really helpful. The other thing we've been talking about is, the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, like has the largest magazine that with the largest circulation, the in-person print magazine that still goes out to something like 16 million. I can't even remember what it is. It's millions and millions and millions of people that actually get that magazine and read it. And so, there are ways to reach like a well-placed article in something like an AARP about grandparents' roles or about what their grandchildren are seeing online or gendered social changes that are affecting boys' views about what success looks like and or violence, political violence. One of the things I often say is like, as of about 3 or 4 weeks ago, in recent polling, political violence is now the number one issue that Americans are concerned about, which is the first time in my memory it's bigger than the economy. And so, like, it's not the economy anymore. The economy is number two. And people are still worried about the economy, but they're really worried about political division and political violence. And we also know that for example, hostile sexism or misogyny is either the biggest predictor or among the top 3 predictors in every single survey I've ever seen in the last 3 or 4 years on political violence, willingness to engage in it, and willingness to support it across multiple countries. So, when you get people who are interested in political violence, who might be willing to listen to ideas about prevention, and you have data that shows what's underpinning it in terms of some of the biggest predictors, and you have an audience that actually reads a magazine that comes to their house. There are ways to reach people who are, who are retired, who are elderly, boomers, and I think we just have to find the pathways. And it's not always internet spaces; it might actually be print magazines.
Throughout this whole conversation and really pervasive around this whole set of issues is the role of the internet. And I do wonder on so many of these things, like if we had a time machine or whatever, and we
Yeah,
kind of remove the internet from this, and of course it's not just the internet, it's like the internet plus mobile devices. This
right.
is a set of
Yeah,
technologies that turn the internet into this kind of almost direct pipe into people's heads.
yeah.
But if we, is the answer, how much of the answer lies in stuff we can do on the internet?
Mm.
And as you say, there are things you can do on print magazines, or sort of, and how much of it lies in just getting people into inhabited space with one another,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
getting people to go to church potlucks, or
yeah, absolutely.
or community forums or whatever. Like I don't,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, less time online is better, right? So less time online has better outcomes for everybody. And so we have seen that with the mental health of teenagers across the world when cell phone bans have been implemented in schools, for example, even though kids don't like it and they're, sometimes parents don't like it, the mental health outcomes are tremendous, right? That, I just talked to a teacher in a school here in DC about it, their first cell phone ban that got implemented last year. And I asked how it was going. And she said, the kids don't love it, but the teachers like it. The only complaint that she's heard is that the teachers say it's too loud in the school now. And so, like, they have to actually think about sound mitigation because noise mitigation issues, because kids are talking to each
Wow.
other, right? And instead of having so having a bell to bell ban, they call it, from the moment your first bell rings to end of the day, has taken off as a policy that can work. I think there are some equity concerns around that. I also talked to another school, the largest public school in DC, who kids have said they have to have their cell phones out because they're required to use hotspots in some cases to access the online learning platforms because the Wi-Fi is not sufficient for the size of the school. There's overcrowding. And so, so a small private school gets to do the ban, a larger public school, those kids have their phones out on their desk to access their hotspot. So I think we have to think about how to make sure that, just like when we do interventions in the public health space, that you don't end up with food deserts or you don't end up with no safe walking trails, but you're giving people advice that's just not realistic for the structures in which they live their lives. But yes, less time is always better for everyone. I often think about how much I miss how when you were waiting in New York, when I lived in New York, for example, waiting for the subway or waiting for the bus, and you just looked around, right? And now if you look around, everyone's
Yeah.
looking down at their phone, and half the time I am too, right? So it's it can be very hard to pull yourself out of it. I think there are also things we can do in terms of tech regulation that helps improve the algorithms. But one of the things we've seen is that those don't, even when they have them, we don't have it in the States at all. And even when you have something like a Digital Safety Act, which you have in Europe or the UK, often the fines aren't sufficient to counter the profit that these companies make from advertisements on content that would be banned. And so it's the implementation has not really proven yet that it can work in terms of really reducing the amount of harmful content that comes across people's screens. Um, so there's amount of time, and then there's what you see, I guess is what I'm saying. And what you're watching is part of the problem. It's not just time online.
We've had many periods before in our history, in our lifetimes, where there was economic uncertainty and finding jobs was difficult, or buying a home, completely fell apart for a while. And
Yeah.
why is now so different
Yeah.
for boys and young men, that it is turned from um, there are cyclical, really challenging times, to girls and women
Mhm.
are behind this, and the LGBTQ plus community is responsible for this, and
Yeah.
Jewish people are responsible for this. Like, how did this happen, that we ended up with so much focus on scapegoating?
I think there are a lot of different things happening all at once, coming out of the COVID era, where everybody spent way too much time online and got extremely isolated, where we had very high rates of depression, particularly among teenagers and young adults. That kind of created a whole sub pocket of a generation that is disaffected, is disillusioned, has high rates of depression and anxiety and loneliness across boys and girls. And so they did create a lot of coping strategies online, including, a ton of online gaming for boys, where there's the games themselves can be very pro-social, effective spaces, enjoyable. Like, I'm not demonizing games, which a third of the world's population plays online. It's the chats, these like in-game chats that can be really kind of toxic cesspools of misogyny, racism, anti-Semitism, gender policing of boys, homophobia. And half of girls worldwide play under a boy's name so that they don't have to deal with it. And so, I think, you just really see that that can normalize, that incubates kind of some of what's happening. And a ton of young men are gamers. And so I think you have to have a strong kind of resistance. There's now a lot of interventions being aimed at the gaming community, including from gaming companies, in some cases, trying to make change and solicit and implement change, just like we'd seen for many years kind of in the fraternity, the Greek world, or in college athletics, like other pockets of places that have had problems with sexual abuse, or with different types of misogyny, or problematic drinking behaviors, or other types of maybe outcomes that were not ideal. And so a lot of interventions had been done in those spaces as well, around consent, let's say, or Title IX regulations or safety. And so I think we're going to see some effectiveness of those interventions. It's just we're always it's like whack-a-mole, and we're catching up, right? And then I think, we are, yes, 2008 was this turning point. It's very difficult for people to live with the same kind of certainty. The job markets are different than they used to be. The idea of having a secure job for a long time, or that there's a housing shortage, and the idea that you could, as one of my colleagues always says, on a plumber's salary in Baltimore, buy a house for your family to live in, which you would have been able to do in the 70s, is just impossible, right? You're not going to buy a brownstone or a little house like anymore on that salary, probably. So I think there are different outcomes that have made it more difficult, this much bigger gap between the wealthy and everybody else. And we have, one thing we don't talk about very often is malign state actors who are also behind a lot of that gendered content and division and polarization online on gender and racial lines. So I'm reading about this right now for something I'm writing, and there's some really good data out there on how sweepingly large some of these gender disinformation campaigns have been, from Venezuela, Iran, Russia, China, countries where bots and trolls have attacked people like Hillary Clinton, to with huge amounts of gender disinformation and attacks, and misogynistic attacks, intended to polarize and weaken American democracy, right? And it worked. And so one of the things I often say is, like, we don't want to be dupes in some authoritarian state's endgame, right? Like, if you're reading stuff online, that's another way to be skeptical about, like, who benefits from the weakening of democracy, like we're seeing right now along gender or racial lines. Like, these divisions, these social divisions, are also to someone else's benefit. And that benefit can be a profiteer online, it can be a politician here, it can also be an authoritarian state elsewhere.
It's interesting there, the role that the social media companies play. They're going to have a lot of the data, right? They will be able to
Yeah.
see the IP addresses and the social graph data that helps to identify these networks of bad actors, state sponsored,
Yeah.
adjacent, whatever. And there was a period a few years ago where they seemed reasonably well aligned with trying to stop this activity.
Yeah.
And they invested a lot in it, and there were big, trust and safety teams, and they were, all kinds of efforts to some degree working with uh, agencies of the federal government, sharing intelligence, all of that kind of thing. That seems to have come to a kind of screeching stop.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
and of course, like in some ways, this act is an interesting paper out from some researchers at Oxford about, the audience kind of likes these things, right? They
Yeah.
like highly emotional, polarizing things, and when presented with
Yeah.
the option of like real factful news, in and or these kind of culture war controversies or ridiculous
Yeah.
extreme things, people will opt for the latter, which is bad for democracy, bad for the world, bad for people's mental health, but pretty good for advertising revenue,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And so, like,
Yeah.
I guess in a world where the main, forces controlling these platforms, the tech companies,
Yeah.
don't really care and aren't that aligned with making them better. Are we just sort of stuck with that? Are
Yeah.
there things you think we can do to change that? Maybe state
Yeah.
action at state levels versus at the federal level? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Yes, salacious, provocative outrage moves faster online. It's more likely to be shared, reshared, commented on. Even if it's being shared in outrage, people will be like, look at this. Like, can you believe this, quiet piggy video? Like that. And so that kind of a salacious thing and a thing that makes you angry, you're more likely to engage. And so actually, but the thing that makes it worse is that the algorithms now and many platforms prioritize that. So one of the things that I often tell kids is if you hit the dislike button on some platforms, you're 5 times more likely to get more content like that than if you hit the like button, right? So because they know the priority is engagement. They want, the platforms all prioritize engagement as the number one metric, right? Because that's how they sell ads. And so what they want is you to stay engaged. And engagement can look like comments, it can look like engaging with friends, or it can look like reshares. I mean, they have different ways of measuring that. But how long you watched a video, did you watch it all the way through? Did you hover? Did you share? Right? There's lots of different ways that they collect that data. But they know what they really know is that if you dislike the content you dislike, you're more likely to engage with. You're going to watch the thing all the way through. You're going to comment on it. You're going to share it with your friends. You're going to put it in a chat to send to people and have a discussion about it. And so they actually prioritize now that you're going to get more content like that. And so I often just say, don't hit the dislike button as much as you might want to. Just scroll past it because it gives you this skewed view then of humanity. You start getting more and more of that kind of content. And, we've seen that for a long time, right? Even when I was growing up and there were only like 3 news channels, right? So you watch ABC, NBC, or CBS, right? That's it. There were a couple of different options. But the local news always leads, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Like that was the kind of the headline, the first stories, like anything that was going to grab the attention and get people to watch that channel over the other channel. And so you still see that kind of thing happening. I think, we advise a lot of the trust and safety committees, commission groups and parts of social media teams and other platforms. And because we feel obligated to, and I will say like the trust and safety, the people who work on the trust and safety teams are fantastic. They make great recommendations. Those recommendations rarely get taken up. And I think that's where I don't know what it would take to encourage, to incentivize, to force, to regulate companies to put safety before profit. But right now, that's not what happens. The profit, incentive is always first because these are private companies. And so it's okay to do the right thing as long as it doesn't hurt the bottom line. I mean, that sounds very cynical. Obviously, there are some protections in place, but even those protections fail, on the regular, where there's errors in the algorithm that allow harmful content to slip through. So, when I talk to kids, one of the first things I ask them, teenagers all the time, like, tell me about the kinds of stuff that you unexpectedly saw online, or what do adults not know about the kinds of things you see online? And it's like, you don't even want to know. I mean, from bestiality to live stream murders, suicides, child abuse, animal abuse, like all by accident, violent porn, right? The kinds of things that, like, at 11, at 12, at 13, and they almost never have told an adult because they don't want their phones to be taken away. So, we start that conversation and then we say, like, what do you think adults should be doing about it? And what they say is they want places to talk about it. They want ways to process it. They want to understand what to do with the things they've seen, how it makes them feel. They don't talk to anyone about it. They don't even really talk to each other about it. And so that's one of the things that worries me the most, is like that we just have kids who accidentally scroll past. And we've all seen stuff, a school shooting by accident, or, and so because that video just pops up on your, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. So many people saw that by accident, right? And yeah, it just shouldn't happen. And kids are seeing that kind of stuff. And so, I want social media companies to be accountable. And I also feel like my personal and my lab's approaches, we can't wait for that. So we'll keep advocating for it. But in the meantime, we focus on making kids more resilient, making communities more resilient, understanding how the algorithms work, and building in ways to have conversations about what they see online. Yeah, sorry.
The amount of small traumas over and over and over again that kids are experiencing is really staggering. I have so many questions still, Cynthia, and I know we're going to run out of time. So like my mind is going in two completely different directions. So I'm going to quickly say, I think entertainment has a role to play in this. And there are programs that I have watched where I have seen this kind of work being done. Ted Lasso is an example.
Yes.
There is a whole episode where there was a release of digital images of women. And there's a whole conversation about, you don't, erase all this stuff off your phone. You don't own those images. You don't have the right to share them because they were shared with you when you were in a relationship. So I hope those kind of things, I think it can have a real impact. Something that I want to make sure we get to that you wrote in your book. And I found it counterintuitive, which is partially why it was so interesting, is that you write that to counteract misogyny, and in misogyny, it's in its broadest sense, LGBTQ hate and discrimination, that we need more equity, not less. And that seemed, if what boys are struggling with is messaging that their opportunities are being taken by girls and women, and that they're being emasculated by girls and women, how is more opportunity, more equity for non-male presenting people this part of the solution?
On the first point, the Hollywood point, basically, it's interesting because that's where we've been spending a lot of time over the last 6 or 7 months in my lab, is trying to create narrative change nationally and globally around the idea of prevention. So this public health approach, but also, for example, when there's a medical drama about a school shooting or a mass shooting, let's make sure that there's also a discussion in the script on prevention. And so there are actually like groups, not just like how you treat the wounds of the survivors, but how, maybe the mental health counselor is there and we're talking about warning signs, or you're introducing the idea of things that could have been prevented, or red flags, or what might have happened differently, or something, anything like that. And so we've seen that with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We've seen that with texting and driving campaigns, with, all kinds of, there's a lot of different social work that's done that kind of brings together, narrative change around social ideas into entertainment media. And I think that that's one of the things that we can do more of. The second thing is helping boys and girls understand, and men and women, like adult people too, do this across the gender spectrum, that it's understand that it's not a zero-sum game. Because I get this too from feminists who argue like, hey, why do I want to put more money into fixing white boys, right? That's a quote from somebody, right? Or why are we talking about the boys' loneliness crisis? Why do you have so much empathy? Someone asked me recently, right? Like that I get that kind of accusation as well. But I think we have to remember it's not a zero-sum game. Both things can be problematic. You can say boys are suffering and struggling, and it doesn't mean that girls and women are doing any better. They still bear the brunt of violence at the hands of boys and men, and don't have gender equity or parity in the workplace, for example. Bear a lot of other challenges because of gender inequities. But you don't have to do one or the other. You can advance both things at once and try to see it a little more holistically.
So Cynthia, as we get to the end of our time, one last question we'd like to ask is sort of what gives you hope right now? Where do you look for signs of optimism and hope?
I mean, I think about this a lot. I have 30 people now in a research lab who spend their days designing, testing out of the box ideas to try to make these things better. And we keep finding things that work. And just since the election, this is a difficult period for a lot of people who are trying to strengthen resilience around democracy. But we've tripled in size during that time. We have really found that one, there are a lot of people who still care about these issues, that communities care, that cities and towns and states really care, parents care, grandparents care, schools care. People do not like across the political spectrum what's happening to kids online, and they're really engaged and interested. And so we've gotten more support during that period of time. We'll still take more if any listeners are out there and want to support it. But we have grown in really remarkable ways because there's so much talent in the DC area, like the absolute most amazing people you could imagine who work on violence prevention, who used to work for the government and now work with us. So that really gives me hope. I think we have an incredible cohort of people, creative, multidisciplinary, committed, like lots of different diverse professional and personal backgrounds who are doing this work, and so much interest globally in what we're finding. And so I don't know how I could not be an optimist about it. I am.
Yeah, that's awfully nice to hear, and congratulations on the growth. That's exciting.
Thanks.
With the funding cuts, it's not what I would have expected, so I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear that's happening. But yes, and anyone interested in supporting the work of Peril, please do look them up. And Cynthia, your book, all of your books, but your most recent book, Man Up, I think is essential reading right now.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, it is. So thank you. That could not have been an easy book to spend time researching and writing. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
It wasn't easy, and yet it really helped drive some of the interventions that we're doing now. We have a whole division now on preventing gendered violence, and with funding and projects from all around the world. So I think it was essential. It wasn't easy. I'm glad the writing is done, and I hope people read it and take time to practice some self-care as well during the hard parts.
Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
That was an incredible conversation. I knew it would be. She's really a remarkable person doing such incredibly important research.
I am encouraged that somebody, with Cynthia's credentials and the organization she's built is focused on this problem and taking it seriously as a kind of scientific exercise, almost really trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work, what kind of interventions are worth investing in. And a lot of tough stuff in that conversation, but I think that for me is, I guess, as it was for her, is kind of the encouraging thing.
Yeah, we're at a time when the role of the scientific method and the value of expertise and doing research has really been degraded. So it's exciting to see that she's getting resources, that she feels like she has a lot of good people who want to be doing this work with her, because man, it's vast.
Yeah.
It's there were things that we didn't even get into talking about today that you and I have discussed, because it is such, um, it, it's difficult to know where to begin. And I guess whenever I think about how huge a problem like this is, it's always reassuring to know that there are lots of people taking small pieces of it. There are
Yeah.
men's health organizations, there are psychological organizations, there are extremism organizations, there are people dealing with youth. So
Yeah.
it's not one entity trying to figure out the solution. It's a lot of people who care about it.
This was a good conversation. I think it's a setup to some of our next conversation with Jessica Yellen. This is in many ways a lot about the problems that we have in the kind of existing information ecosystem. I think part of what we want to talk to Jessica about is what gets built next, and how do we, particularly around kind of understanding of news and sort of public events, what are the kinds of systems and spaces and tools that we need for a kind of new media that better informs us and kind of helps us get back to some kind of coherence. So looking forward to that conversation as well.
Really excited about that conversation. I think she has a lot of um, really good ideas and a lot of positive feeling about the potential of what can be done, what is very possible. So, John, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
love having these conversations
Me
with
too.
you.
We'll see you here next week.
All right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody, for joining.